April 8, 1945. One day before the end, in a quiet office in Berlin, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris sat alone with a decision that would define his final hours. He held in his hands classified intelligence, the same intelligence that had arrived on his desk exactly 2 years earlier. The numbers were still there. The truth was still there. But everything else had changed. The question was no longer whether he believed the report. The question was whether he had the courage to speak it aloud, knowing that truth-telling in the Third Reich had become an act of treason. This is the story of a man who knew what had to be said, understood the price of saying it, and chose to say it anyway. March 17, 1943. That was the day Admiral Canaris received the report about Willow Run, a single factory in Michigan that would change everything. But that date never truly left him. It followed him through every subsequent year of the war like a ghost, a specter of truth that no amount of official business could exorcise. The numbers were staggering. 1 bomber every hour, 24 aircraft a day from a single American factory. When Canaris first saw these figures, shock gave way to something worse, certainty. The certainty that he alone, among the highest levels of German military leadership, truly understood what those numbers meant. Germany had already lost. But knowing something and being able to act on that knowledge were two entirely different matters in Nazi Germany. Canaris understood this distinction intimately. At 59 years old, he was an admiral in the German Navy and head of military intelligence since 1935. He had navigated the treacherous waters of Hitler's regime for a decade, learning the art of survival in a system built on ideology rather than reality. He knew which truths could be whispered and which truths would get a man killed. The Willow Run report had been the latter category from the beginning. When he presented the initial findings to Goering, the Reichsmarschall laughed in his face. "Americans cannot build airplanes," Goering sneered. "They are very good at refrigerators and razor blades." That conversation told Canaris everything he needed to know about the receptiveness of Nazi leadership to uncomfortable facts. He had experienced that laugh before, that particular kind of arrogant dismissal that characterized men who had confused ideology with reality so completely they could no longer distinguish between them. He tried anyway. Throughout 1943 and into 1944, his intelligence network continued gathering evidence. More agents confirmed the production numbers. Japanese naval attachés, Germany's own allies, sent back reports of American industrial capacity with an almost apologetic tone, as if embarrassed to deliver such devastating news. Every piece of new intelligence only reinforced the original conclusion. The mathematical certainty of German defeat grew stronger with each passing month, accumulating like snow on a mountainside, waiting only for the moment when the weight would become unbearable. But Canaris kept the full implications quiet. Not completely silent, he was too honest for that, but carefully measured. He briefed select officers. He submitted reports that documented the facts while stopping short of their logical conclusion. He did what a military professional could do within a dictatorship. He provided accurate information to those willing to receive it while protecting himself from accusations of defeatism. He became a man caught between two imperatives, the duty to tell the truth and the survival instinct that demanded silence. It was a careful balance, and it worked after a fashion. Canaris survived, while other truth-tellers did not. Colleagues who had spoken too plainly found themselves transferred, demoted, or worse. He maintained his position, his authority, his life. But as 1944 turned into 1945, as the Red Army closed in from the east while American and British forces closed in from the west, Canaris began to understand that his careful balance was collapsing. The ground beneath him was shifting. The regime itself was entering its death throes, and with it, the calculations that had kept him alive were becoming obsolete. He began to notice something troubling. The men around him were becoming more desperate, not less. As military defeats accumulated, Hitler became more convinced of final victory. As intelligence reports grew grimmer, the regime's ideology became more rigid, more demanding, more willing to purge those who failed to maintain absolute faith. It was as if the Nazi leadership had entered a kind of collective psychosis, where reality and belief had become completely inverted. The worse things became, the more desperately they clung to the narrative of inevitable triumph. By early 1945, the illusion was impossible to maintain. Germany was being crushed. Soviet forces had liberated Poland and were now inside the borders of Germany itself, advancing with relentless momentum toward Berlin. American forces had crossed the Rhine and were sweeping through the industrial heartland. The Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as a meaningful air force. The Wehrmacht was being ground into submission by enemies that possessed overwhelming industrial and material superiority, exactly as Canaris had predicted 2 years earlier when no one would listen. The prophecy that had seemed impossible then was now manifesting itself with terrible precision. More dangerously, people were beginning to notice his warnings. The very reports he had submitted carefully, trying to hedge his language, they had been noticed. Worse, they had been interpreted as evidence of defeatism. In Hitler's paranoid court, being a realist was increasingly dangerous. The regime was entering its final desperate phase, and desperation was making it more ideologically rigid, not less. It was searching for scapegoats, looking for traitors, trying to blame external enemies and internal saboteurs for failures that were actually rooted in mathematical reality. Canaris understood the pattern. First came the accurate warnings delivered through proper channels. Then came the dismissal. You are overestimating the enemy. Then came suspicion. Why are you spreading such defeatist propaganda? And finally came the accusation. You are working against the Führer. He could see the trajectory of his own fate written in the histories of other officers who had spoken too plainly. Canaris had connections beyond military intelligence. He had used the Abwehr to protect members of the German resistance, including the theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He had worked to keep Spain from joining the Axis, an act of strategic sabotage that had cost Hitler dearly. He had done what he could within the constraints of operating within the Nazi system to limit the damage the regime could inflict. But his activities had not gone unnoticed by the SS. They watched him. They waited for a mistake. And they found one in the aftermath of the failed July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler in 1944. German officers, men of honor and conscience, had attempted to kill the Führer. The plot failed. The Gestapo investigation that followed was ruthless and comprehensive. It uncovered a vast network of resistance, and many trails led directly to the Abwehr. Many trails led to Canaris. He was arrested in 1944, but not executed immediately. Strangely, he was held, investigated, moved from one facility to another as the system itself began to disintegrate. And now, in these final days of April 1945, with Soviet forces already in Berlin and Hitler preparing for his final act in the bunker, Canaris found himself at Flossenbürg, moved from prison to prison, as the system itself fragmented into chaos. But before the end came, and Canaris knew the end was coming for him, he faced a choice that had haunted him for 2 years. The question was simple but profound. Should he speak the full truth about what he had known? Should he finally articulate, without hedging or careful professional language, exactly what the Willow Run report had meant? Should he tell the story of how the leadership had refused to accept mathematical reality? Why? Should he break his silence, knowing it could accomplish nothing material, but might at least preserve the historical record? The answer came not from external circumstances, but from something internal. Canaris had spent his entire career making careful calculations about survival. He had been a professional intelligence officer, a man trained to assess risk, to weigh probabilities, to protect himself and his position. That training had kept him alive through a decade of Nazi rule when so many others had died. But those calculations had also cost him something he was only now beginning to understand: his integrity as a human being. As April 1945 became his final month, Canaris began to understand that survival had a price. The price was silence. The price was allowing the lie to persist unchallenged. Every time he had hedged his language, he had been complicit in a system that valued ideology over truth. Every report he had softened to avoid accusations of defeatism had been a small betrayal of the integrity he valued most. Canaris had always believed in facts. Intelligence work was about discerning truth from propaganda, signal from noise, reality from wishful thinking. He had built his entire professional identity on the principle that accurate information mattered. But what good was accurate information if it was never spoken clearly? What good was knowing the truth if that knowledge was hoarded, carefully packaged, hedged with professional language designed to protect the speaker rather than illuminate the listener? He thought of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the theologian he had tried to protect. Bonhoeffer had written about the problem of complicity, about how remaining silent in the face of evil was itself a form of participation in that evil. At the time, those writings had seemed like idealistic ravings. Now, facing his final days, Canaris wondered if perhaps the theologian had understood something the admiral had missed. In his final days at Flossenburg, Canaris made his choice. He decided to speak, not in reports, not in carefully worded briefings, but directly to those who would listen. To fellow prisoners who understood what was happening. To the historical record, knowing that someday someone would want to know the truth about what he had known and when he had known it. He decided to articulate what the Willow Run Report had truly meant, that Germany had not lost because of tactical failures or insufficient will or the superiority of enemy generals. Germany had lost because it had been industrially outmatched on a scale that no amount of courage or ideology could overcome. The mathematics of production were immutable. They could not be negotiated with or overcome through spiritual discipline. They simply were. He decided to say that the Nazi leadership had received accurate information about this reality and had chosen to reject it, that the reports had been filed and dismissed, that the truth had been presented and denied, that in choosing ideology over mathematics, the regime had doomed itself and countless others. This was defeatism by the strictest Nazi definition. This was treason by any measure a regime could apply. Canaris understood this clearly, but he had come to understand something else, that the careful balance he had maintained for so long had ultimately served the regime more than it had served truth. His choice to speak clearly was an act of rebellion against that culture. It was also almost certainly a death sentence. But Canaris was no longer under any illusion that he would survive this war. The only question was what he would do with whatever time remained. Would he carry his knowledge to the grave, protecting himself even in death through continued silence? Or would he speak, knowing that his words might be forgotten, dismissed, or misunderstood, but at least the record would contain the truth? In the end, he chose to speak. On April 9, 1945, in the final chaotic weeks of the war, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris was executed at Flossenburg concentration camp. He was stripped naked and slowly bled to death with piano wire. It was a brutal, humiliating end for a man who had spent his life trying to navigate a brutal, humiliating system with dignity and principle. But in his final days, Canaris had chosen clarity over survival. He had chosen to articulate the truth about Willow Run, about industrial capacity, about the mathematics of defeat. He had chosen to say what needed to be said, even knowing the cost. His death changed nothing in the immediate sense. The war would end within weeks, regardless of what Canaris said or did not say. History would move on. But the story of Canaris, the story of a man who knew the truth and kept it carefully hidden, then chose to speak it clearly in his final hours, that story changed something. After the war, Canaris's diaries were recovered, his reports were declassified, his colleagues testified about his warnings. The full scope of what he had known and when he had known it became clear. The historical record now shows that Admiral Wilhelm Canaris understood with remarkable precision exactly what the Willow Run Report meant. He understood it in March 1943, and he never stopped understanding it. The question was never whether he knew. The question was always whether he would speak, and in the end, he did. Not soon enough to change the course of events, not effectively enough to prevent catastrophe, but clearly enough that the truth could never again be completely hidden behind careful language and professional discretion. This is the legacy of Canaris's choice. In an age of information, the most dangerous thing is not ignorance. Ignorance can be corrected. The most dangerous thing is information that is known, but not acted upon. Facts that are acknowledged, but dismissed. Truths that are whispered in private, but denied in public. Canaris had embodied that danger for years, trying to survive within a system that rewarded silence over truth. But in his final hours, he chose differently. He chose to be a messenger rather than a clarity over caution. The war ended anyway. The regime fell, regardless of what he said. But the choice itself, the act of speaking clearly about what he knew, that mattered. It always matters. Because a society that hides from uncomfortable facts, that relegates truth to private conversations while maintaining comfortable fictions in public, that society is doomed not by external enemies, but by its own refusal to see. Canaris understood this in the end, and he chose to speak anyway. In doing so, he became something he had never been during his long career, a man whose integrity was finally aligned with his actions. It cost him his life, but it preserved his soul.